the first question that I am particularly interested in is one that also interests a lot of managers, and particularly stimulating innovation and creativity is often mentioned as a top priority for management. And in fact, according to CEO surveys, it's widely regarded as the greatest human resource challenge facing organizations. So it's not just any challenge, in fact, the greatest human resource challenge. So why is it so hard to encourage innovation? Is it something about the topic per se? Is it something about how our incentives are misaligned? Is it very difficult just to get people to think about innovation? What hinders innovation? Ashley, if you could get us started with your experiences of why it is so difficult to encourage innovation.
Sure. I think, I'm not sure that the challenge is encouraging it, but the challenge is to not stifle it when it happens. I think it's there, and companies unintentionally squash it. And I think it's related to, we're all moving very hard. Organizations are set up by design to be going after specific objectives and goals, and there's things they want to achieve. And there's not a lot of space in there for just recognizing and taking appreciation of innovation. And so I think you get managers who have ideas that bubble up, and they unintentionally stifle it because an idea can feel like a distraction, and innovation can feel like a distraction off of what an organization is working toward. And so I think companies that don't make a real point of hearing out innovation and really making a place where ideas can come forward easily, and taking the opportunity to really engage in them, whether they're a good idea or not a good idea. I think those companies that do that well get more than their fair share. And I think they get the opportunity to really encourage it, because it will build on itself. If they're happening, people see it happening, it tells you it can happen here. But I think we unintentionally squash it.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I mean, I agree completely. I think innovation and encouraging innovation is more about culture and environment, to follow up with what Ashley is talking about. And from my background, I come from a product development background. And in many cases, it's very difficult to fit innovation to a typical product development process, because you can't schedule innovation. You can't say, okay, I'm going to put it on the Gantt chart. In 3 weeks, we're going to have a new innovation that's going to cut the cost of this new product in half, and we're going to track that, right? Because innovation is all about serendipitous collisions, things that happen without realizing it. It's all about collaboration, and to Ashley's point, usually in my past experience, and it's sort of counter to what a lot of innovation process is focused on. The ideas are not the problem, right? To Ashley's point, there are always great ideas in organizations. The problem is they usually get squashed, or there's no way to go actually implement them because it doesn't fit into our typical process of, what is the return on investment on that, when it's going to be delivered. And so, how do you go and set up structures that allow that collaboration, those collisions amongst workers, and then support it with some sort of, rapid prototyping process that allows you to lower the risk profile and de-risk the ideas, so that you can actually go and put it into a standard investment process.
Okay, yeah.
So I work
in on this too.
Sorry, Florian. So I work in an industry which has been going backwards in innovation for 50 years. The more money we put into drug research, the less we get out of it. Having worked for a lot of large companies, I guess, Ashley and Phil's point, stifling it is one of the things they do very well. And so I saw 3 basic problems. One is a lot of companies don't actually manage for it, that there's a big tension between control and allowing for exploration. And most companies are going to tend towards control. The second thing is they don't organize for it. In the history of innovation is really about the exchange of ideas. And we organize often in companies by silos and by field, which isolates ideas. And the third thing is we definitely don't hire for it. In my industry in particular, mastery of knowledge is a higher qualification than people who are actually problem solvers. And innovation needs people who are going to consider breaking the rules, not laws, but the unwritten assumptions and rules of a field require people with a mindset towards creative thinking, towards creative destruction. And we often sort of knowledge backgrounds, but not the people with the backgrounds towards whatever. So I guess I see you have a multifaceted problem, and most managers I used to work for would try and take one thing, you know, incentives would solve it, or how I organize the desks would solve it, or whatever, when it takes all the elements we've discussed here to create an ecosystem that works.
Okay, so something that that all of you have mentioned is this issue of sort of stifling innovation. It reminds me a little bit of this sort of like, what are the, you know, this is a, how can we get our innovation workers, our knowledge workers, how can they be sure that they are sort of in a safe zone with ideas? How do we not stifle ideas? Is there what can companies do so that workers feel safe to be forthcoming with their ideas?
I think one of the biggest things is around culture, and I think Phil mentioned it. I think really making a space where people can feel that risk is okay, because you know, everything we just talked about was the ability to take a risk without fear of being fired or fear of failure or fear of missing your bonus or whatever it is. And I do think culture and it's a low ego environment. We specifically reward for low ego type of management and leadership, and that comes from the top. And so I think that helps break that barrier of hearing an idea and feeling like, oh, it didn't come from me as a manager, I'm going to squash it, or that's risky, I don't want to pursue it, and just letting there be free space where people can bubble things up and take a chance. But I think it really boils down to culture more than you know, a specific program where you set aside, you know, 10 minutes a day to think about innovative thoughts.
Let me jump back right in here. Is the problem with stifling innovation, is it already at the origination level, or is it more at the implementation level, or is it sort of like taking them a little bit further? Is it the problem that people don't even want to voice their ideas, or is it that they feel, well, even if I voice my idea, it will get acknowledged, but it will never get implemented?
Yeah, if you look at it from my experiences in product development companies, right, you have a very standard process where you go through stages of a concept phase to a investment phase after concept, where you start planning the product, and then you design the product, then you launch it. And those are pretty typical in any large product development product. I don't care if you're developers or whatever it may be. And the problem is that if you're a general manager of one of these businesses, your incentive, you know, you're paid, you know, in terms of your compensation on this quarter, next quarter, and by and large, you probably have a year and a half, maybe 2 year horizon maximum. And so when you're looking at your investments and, you know, how do I want to spend millions of dollars and teams of 30 plus engineers, and committing them for projects that could be 12 to 24 months, it's right. And so it's very hard to say, you know, I'm going to really go and spend a bunch of money. I don't know how long it's going to take, because like I said previously, it's hard to schedule innovation for an entirely new idea, which I'm not sure if the technology is going to work. I don't know if customers are really going to adopt it, versus the next turn of the crank of the widget that we're making. And so the very nature of how the products are structured, or how the organizations are structured, the decision-making process, encourages incremental innovation over truly, you know, breakthrough, or, you know, the overly used word disruptive innovation.
Yeah. Bob, you mentioned also this, you know, tension between control and exploration, and also this, also the problem with organizing by silos. Is the right response maybe for companies to not have such compartmentalization, but to rather to have much more cross-functional teams and have that lead to more innovation? Or is that not sort of a catch-all remedy?
You know, I guess my view is there is no catch-all remedy, right? That every business has to look at the workflow of its business and then create the ecosystem that matches that workflow. In our sector, where discovery timelines can be a decade or more, we've organized at Merrimack by multidisciplinary teams. We don't have any departments. We don't have any silos. There are other companies that have completely separated the innovation or discovery group from the later stages to isolate them. And those are all the companies that are doing the best, where they create an ecosystem where, in the commercial side or the later stages, failure is a problem and it's expensive. You want to get that mindset out of the early stages. And so best to have it in a separate building, a separate culture where it's okay to fail, where ideas are welcomed, because you can contaminate the earlier stages with all those later stage problems, right? So I do think multidisciplinary teams in a lot of settings are best. But the more complex the problem, the less that's known about the fundamental science, teams do better. But there are certainly instances where just forcing yourself down the knowledge curve can also help in other areas, or repetition can help. It's not as if there's a single solution across the spectrum, but understanding what the underlying technology or problem is, or where you're trying to innovate, and matching to that, I think is the thing that I've seen often misses it. Most people just read an HBR article about, hey, look at what Apple did, let's just do that. And they're making shoes in Taiwan. There's such a grab basket of things that sound good, as opposed to studying your workflow and saying, okay, what do I need to innovate on? What are the dimensions? Where do I need to innovate versus not? And then optimizing that environment and location. It's more the knee-jerk stuff that I see that is a sign of the stifling.
Yeah.
And employees, you see these things change all the time. You don't have any consistency, and that's maddening, right?
Yeah. Okay. So as I very much echo this the problem of catch-all remedies. I think they are, as management scholars, we sometimes push towards having easy and simple solutions when in fact there isn't an easy and simple solution. Of course, the other side is being an economist, where sometimes, as an economist, you get accused of always giving two answers to a question, and one being one side and another side. I think that's also a little bit manifested itself in this large debate on compensation on pay for performance and how it interacts with innovation. Phil mentioned it a little bit at the beginning with his response on compensation policies, and I wanted to jump in partly out of my own personal interest of whether pay for performance or other sort of bonus compensation policies are indeed detrimental to innovation. We've danced a little bit around the question of what really works for innovations. What are the things that definitely don't work for innovations? What is really, really bad? What is not effective for encouraging innovation, and why is it not effective? And why does it maybe sometimes still get deployed? Phil?
Yeah, so my axe to grind that I have in this area is around compensation, and particularly bonus structures at a lot of large corporations. And so, many organizations want to have each siloed functional group or business group have their own set of metrics and bonus and compensation determined based upon that, right? And that makes logical sense because you sort of own your own destiny. The problem is it tends to decrease collaboration and innovation. And so, a real life example is you have an engineering organization and you want to go and have their key metric to drive cost. Makes sense, right? Engineering should be as a key driver driving cost out of the products. Then you have a services organization, and their key metric is reliability and the speed to go fix the product. Again, makes sense. However, when you go and try to look at an innovation such as predictive analytics to predict when a product may fail, and remote resolution where I can repair a product over the internet versus having to send a screwdriver and a van and a repair person to the product, that becomes very difficult because that adds cost to the product. So the engineering team says, well, that's going to decrease my bonus because I have to add sensors and intelligence to the product. And then you get into this debate versus how do I go really look at a collaborative, cross-functional, innovative solution, because it's too hard to work across these bonus structures versus just having a bonus structure that is much more aligned to the overall goals of the company and allowing incentives for innovation based upon a personal modifier based upon the behavior of those individuals. And so that's been my experience and something I'm, been vehemently against in my past experiences, some successfully.
So the issue is on the individualization of incentives, that it's just for your own performance or the performance of your own department or group.
Combined with an overall goal of what is the company. So everyone's aligned to what is the goals of the company, and you can define that whatever makes sense for the company. It could be profit and revenue. It could be one overarching strategic goal, and then the flexibility of the managers and the leaders in an organization to adjust up or down a individual's compensation and bonus based on their performance and behaviors.
Yeah,
I think we try to overcomplicate it too many times.
The big problem that I see is at least in core research in biology and chemistry and the work that we do, is there's a massive mismatch in most companies between what is actually measurable and what can be transparent, and what actually ultimately winds up in a reward. At Merrimack, we started years ago with a standard annual bonus system. People set goals, we got there, and over time, as we studied it, we learned that, research often going backward 3 steps was better than going forward in the wrong direction 4 steps. What you could anticipate or assume was a goal didn't always make sense. And so we found over time, we didn't really have a way to be transparent or measurable on the core research work or the innovation part of our business. So we eventually ended up just getting rid of year-end performance reviews and bonuses, and basically created team sessions for people to discuss how things were going, and team events. Evaluations and stock options, because we couldn't find a measurable, transparent way to say these innovation groups are doing well, because the groups that we tracked over time often went backwards for 2 years and made the biggest leap forward, whereas the ones that looked like they were making progress hit a wall that wasn't achievable or couldn't be overcome. So using time frame to something measurable is the big mismatch I see.
Yeah. So it's the issue between what is measurable and what can we reward, or what is really socially desirable. Something else that you highlight a little bit is this issue of the time dimension tension. So if we could wait 4 or 5 years and then see what works, and then reward exactly that what works, I think then there wouldn't be any problem. The problem is that, is it really sustainable to wait 4 or 5 years before we decide how bonuses are allocated?
Well, I would follow up on that and say, do we always want to just be rewarding what works? I think to encourage a highly innovative environment, you need to be able to reward innovation, and sometimes that means fast failure. And so I think we want to be careful about just looking for what works. Of course, we want things to be innovative and work, but I think it can go the other way. I also think I think companies have a tendency to really focus both bonus programs, performance rewards, whatever it is, on specific goals, whatever the specific goals are, and it really just squeezes out innovation. Your whole day, your whole mission is around the very clearly identified goals that are already being worked toward, and innovation's often not on that agenda. And if it's not, there's no room in what you're doing, and therefore there's no reward for it. So if we don't make space, it won't be there.
Yeah. So this highlights a point that I would also, want to emphasize, that failure can be a really great thing, because failure is often, indicative that there was risk taking, that there was exploration, and that's something that as a company or as an organization we might want to encourage. My favorite example of this is that companies like 3M sometimes even hand out awards for the best failure or even the greatest failure, because it does, get their knowledge workers or workers to come up with very ambitious ideas that often, by the nature of their ambition, end up as very, very, very big failures.
Yeah, and I agree. One of the things that I've done in the past is to go and put together teams that are allowed to go and do very quick, rapid prototyping, fail fast, because to some of the previous comments, with metrics, it's very hard to go and even determine, if an idea is a good one or not, right? I've gone in the past and done the activities where you try to go put together crowdsourcing and all sorts of voting mechanisms and a whole bunch of metrics to go evaluate ideas. And it quickly becomes like one of the opening scenes in Dead Poet Society, where Robin Williams starts reading the introduction to the poetry book, and they talk about rating poetry on 2 different axes, and he says, rip it all out, because you can't rate poetry. It's the same thing with innovation. It's very hard to come up with a scoring system that says, okay, these are good and these are bad. And so what you can do is increase your speed to go and prototype something and see if there is merit or not, right? Versus trying to spend time evaluating it. Just go prototype as many as you can.
Yeah. So given that you mentioned this issue of sort of prototyping as many things as you can, are there sort of things that, or policies that work particularly well at encouraging stuff? So we've heard of stuff about corporate culture. We talked a little bit about compensation, but there's other things like, you know, evaluation, feedback, workplace perks. You know, I mentioned this stuff about rewards for failure. One thing that comes up a lot recently in the literature that I've seen are these ideation platforms where there's relatively small rewards given out for ideas that you can just post to the entire company, and then they get picked up. Is there something that you have seen in your company that works really, really well at getting people to speak their mind and come up with ideas?
So we use a format that's basically an ideation platform that we call innovation forums. So twice a quarter, we have these all company open meetings where people present new ideas and then break them up into small groups to go see what they can make of them. And so you create this habit of every quarter, people are gonna take 3 or 4 hours break and go try and come up with something brand new. And you may not show up with the idea or have asked to present one to start, but you're gonna join a team to try and build that idea. So it's almost muscle building. And it's an important habit. It's important to see that trying and failure is great and failure is rewarded. I think other thing I would say is rewards, maybe not always compensation, but rewards are critical. You mentioned the 3M rewards, you know, for best failure. You got to do all those things where acknowledging efforts, acknowledging trying. And I didn't mean to imply earlier that you reward on things that worked in the project that worked, that people will set up experiments. Did the experiment happen such that they were able to get their learning, right, is the key metric, not that, oh, the idea worked. It's that you were able to do it. And in the research, sometimes it takes 2 times longer to figure out how to set up the experiment when it's a novel area. That's what I meant. The time frame of those is off. But rewards, very broadly defined, are essential to continue to reinforce the habits you want, whether it's monetary or cultural or emotional or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with what Bob said on, I think, the rewards and framing that particular recognition piece is really important. I think people love getting kudos for what they've done, and you know, a lot of research on a pat on the back will give you as much lift as a bonus and sometimes more. You know, recognize the heck out of it and do it in a really public forum. We have total company meetings, and we always highlight the folks who have come up with something innovative, what they've done. They come to stage, they get a lot of glory on it. Those bragging rights are a big deal. And we also use, just to follow one other way, is we have, it's sort of like an intranet, but it's more of a, allows ongoing chatting. And we do see a lot of ideas generated there, and because it's open, people can comment and they can be voted up. And so we see a lot there. It also gives people an easy way to put something out and see if it catches. And it also, again, gives a way for people to have some recognition and some bragging rights in a really easy, low fidelity way.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing that we haven't touched upon is how do you provide the resources and the structure so that folks can go take those ideas and actually prototype them and hopefully bring them to market. And so there's lots of different ways to do that, but I think it's important as leaders in organizations that we go and allow individuals and give them resources to go and either take 3 months off their day job, or partner them with an innovation team and a set of technologists, if it's a technology company, that can go and quickly prototype their idea. And then even more so than that, allow those those self-directed teams then to go take that idea into market. So many times we then, even if we get to that prototype stage, then try to throw it back over the wall to a product or business group, versus allowing those individuals to actually flow with it through the development cycle and back into the business, because they're going to be the most passionate about making it work. But too often, from an HR perspective and organizational dynamic perspective, we're too concerned about keeping people in their current job versus allowing them to roll and flow with an idea and innovation.
Yeah. So these are all great points, and I want to now again encourage our audience to come up with questions. There's a few of you have already asked some. I want to go back to something that Bob mentioned earlier, which one of the 3 points of like how we stifle innovation in companies. Bob, you mentioned that we definitely don't hire for innovation. In particular, what I'd like to know is like, how do organizations, or how should organizations identify, attract, and retain employees who are particularly innovative, and how do we bring out the best in these employees? Like, how do we spot these employees in the first place? How do we make sure that they come to our organization? And then finally, how do we retain
them? So I can only speak for the drug business, which I've been in for too long. But in our industry, we tend to overemphasize those academic credentials, which tend to be acknowledgments of knowledge base and not skill sets in challenging convention and assumptions and breaking down barriers, which are the characteristics of good problem solvers. So what we do in our screening, we actually have an integration of a pods group, to follow up on Phil's comments. So ideas that come out of these innovation forums, you can take your idea into a group, and there's resources, and you can do tape, chicken wire, you can build things and all that kind of stuff. We actually hire people for that group specifically with almost case interviews like the consulting firms do, where you create problems. Then we ask people, do you accept the structure of the problem? Do you challenge it? And then here we do leadership training and management training and employee training on those sort of creative destruction skills, because everyone can do it. But it is a muscle, we think, and you have to practice it to do it well. And definitely people in the interview process have got more of it than less. So it's understanding that's a key component of innovation. And then I think something to follow up on what Ashley said is something else that gets missed is, in our view, the person who cares the most about the issue is the one most likely to push the hardest towards a breakthrough. And so finding those people passionate for the problem or the idea, and to Phil's point, letting them continue with it actually increases your chance of success as well. And so I think oftentimes I see in the larger companies, they go for skill sets and experience in a field, whereas you need the passion and the open sort of creative destruction mindset will do better every time. And that's our view. And that's what our experience has been over time.
So let me jump right in here with a question that's actually asked by 2 of our viewers. Both Adam and an anonymous viewer asked, is it really our objective to encourage everyone to innovate? Isn't it the case that if we're getting everybody to participate, then it becomes a little bit too much of a distraction, and maybe it will even lead to suboptimal behavior? Are there any downsides to getting everybody involved, or should we sort of keep creative thinking or out-of-box thinking or innovation-driven thinking to a select few in the company?
I'm a big fan of innovation at all levels across all jobs. And I think innovation looks differently, of course, in different places. I mean, what you expect perhaps of your software developers for innovation is probably not the same as you expect of your accounts payable group. But I do think both can bring innovation to what they're doing and probably make the company more effective. In the case of an accounts payable, as my example, more efficient perhaps. I just had somebody on my team who works on our immigration process. That is very rote and time consuming and expensive. They figured out a way to do one piece of that much more efficiently she brought it forward. It's a great idea. It's going to save us a ton of hours every week in getting these things done. So, you know, in my mind, that's a great example of somebody feeling confident to think creatively, feeling confident to raise it up and make it happen. It's not a new product, but it is one little way that they feel empowered to be innovative.
Yeah. So can innovation actually, or giving people a voice, even be sort of a private benefit that I can use to substitute for other monetary rewards? Because that almost seemed like what, you know, that where maybe the innovation per se isn't what we're looking for, but we're giving people sort of a way of expressing themselves, and that's something that they like doing. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we talked about Prof awards earlier, and if you can get people to be engaged and own their environment, and if part of that process is sort of encouraging to rethink processes and accounts payable and improve on them and value their ideas, then you've got more engagement and ownership and a higher likelihood that they're going to solve problems on their own without requiring, you know, outside consultants or something, right? You save tremendous resources. And so I think it's a huge benefit.
Yeah, I think, you know, in terms of, you mentioned the question about attracting innovation and creative talent, you know, the best way to go do that, as well as keep them in the organization, is the recognition, right? Allowing them to present their ideas to senior management, giving them the resources and the ability to go and take those innovations into prototypes and into market. For most folks, in my experience, is much more important than cutting them a check.
Yeah. I want to jump now to a few more of the audience questions. Casey Pickett, graduate from 2011, asks, what successful efforts have you found in encouraging cooperation among groups that compete with one another for resources? So this is a little bit the silo question that we had previously that Bob answered. But it also has a slightly different tint of sort of saying, okay, we've got to come up with many ideas at the beginning. So that presumably means that we have many different people working, or many different teams working on similar questions. How do we get both cooperation between these different teams as well as competition across the teams? Is there anything that you have found to work particularly well?
So I think this is really about framing up the problem. And, you know, when you go into it with, well, we have a limited set of resources and we have to compete against resources, and that's the culture of the organization, you know, that's a big red flag, right? Because the only reason why resources are limited is because a company's not growing, right? And so if you can go and deliver and come up with ideas and improve innovations, whatever that innovation may be. It could be an efficiency innovation, as Ashley mentioned. It could be a new product that go and increase revenues and or lower cost. That frees up resources, right? And if you have an organization and leaders that are willing to go invest in those types of projects, then, you know, resources are just an excuse. They shouldn't be a limiter. But if you're looking at it as a zero-sum game, then that organization, I can guarantee you, will not be successful and not innovate.
Yeah. Let me go back a little bit also, since it's related to the answer here of how do we get people to work kind of in teams. So many of you have highlighted the issue that we need to have these cross-functional teams, that we don't want to have these silos, that we want to have efficient sharing of ideas. Is the right way forward just to make everybody a stakeholder by giving them equity options in the company, or a sort of stock options with the right vesting periods on this? So one of the things, for example, that we know about companies that do a lot of innovation is that they tend to have more reliance on group compensation. They tend to have more reliance on long-term incentives, and they tend to have a lot of reliance also on broad-based stock option plans. And the puzzle sometimes is okay, it's true that we have a broad-based stock option plan, but my impact on the company of 10,000 or even 100,000 employees is so small. Like, why should I be incentivized in any way whatsoever by just holding a tiny share in the company? or is it just about the signal of having that broad-based stock compensation?
So I'm a big believer in that. That's what I had mentioned earlier, that having everyone's bonus based upon the overall success of the company, however the company just decides that should be determined. Having broad-based stock options, I think helps a lot. It's sort of gone by the wayside. I was fortunate to be at Dell in its early growth days, and that was the case back in those days. And that creates a culture where when new businesses are being created, for example, when we created our Dell printer business, where all sorts of folks that aren't even a part of that business were coming to me and saying, how can we help? What can we do to make this new venture successful? And that was part of the culture, because everyone at the end of the day, was compensated by and large based upon the success of the company. And when those structures go away and it becomes, not as again, more expensive to go and deliver stock options into lower levels of the organization, you don't have that incentive, right? If it's just the senior execs who are benefiting from the overall success of the company, you don't have individuals who really want to go above and beyond for the company to succeed, because then it's just a paycheck.
Yeah. I think that broad equity has a really positive impact. So we have broad-based equity across our entire company. Everyone has equity, and I think that matters because everybody's got skin in the game, and you feel like you're part of that whole team rowing together. But I would actually say I don't think that particular item is the one that encourages people to collaborate and work in teams. I would get back to, I don't think it discourages it, it certainly helps, but I think what is more important, I think hiring the right people who want to work with others, who like to work in teams, who like to collaborate by nature. I think that really matters a lot. If you get the right people through the door, it will compound on itself. And then I think back to culture, a culture where leadership, managers, people expect it, that you're going to work together, you're going to work in teams, you're going to collaborate. And your reward systems, of course, have to support that. If they're in conflict, then the whole thing will fall apart. But I think there's a lot of pieces that come together to make collaboration and team work.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm in academia now, and there are no bonuses, right? And so it's not a inhibitor. It's not a encouragement as well. But that culture of having staff, faculty, as well as students that want to collaborate and just contribute on ideas is critical. But if you're going to have compensation, you should have it that it's everyone's rowing in the same direction.
Yeah.
Completely agree.
I have one really interesting question here from one of our viewers who has been following the debate here and says, as highlights the constraints in building innovative solutions within large corporations. Now, if it's so difficult to innovate within large corporations, would it make any sense for these organizations just to go out and buy startups, sort of not even do the innovation in-house, but rather just say, we're going to outsource this and just buy innovative other companies that are in our field?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a strategy. I've been part of previous organizations that have done that, but it's expensive. Right, and in many cases, there are ideas that the corporation I was a part of had before others had done.
I would say, yeah, it's not. It's.
Well, let me, Bob. Can you hear us?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, please.
Right. So I'm not sure it's about the total size of the corporation. I think it's a little bit like using incentives that are long term. More of a matter of getting out of the way than having the right solution locally. The right solution is locally, not major in a corporation. So there are large corporations that have really great innovation groups, but they think really hard about how to organize them locally, as opposed to trying to create a master plan that innovation happens the same way across an entire company. And so, 3M Labs or the great Bell Labs are great examples of where you create the right ecosystem for optimizing a certain type of sort of raw, innovation at a certain level in a local place. So I don't think there's a distinction between large and small as companies. I think there's a distinction between large companies who want to create standard processes that'll stifle innovation everywhere, versus large companies that actually understand they need separate environments and ecosystems to support specific types of work processes.
So is then the issue that when I'm starting off small, most of the time I'm doing exploration anyway. As I become larger, I'm focused on some aspects of my business where I'm just doing exploitation or control. And I'd still like to do exploration, but I need to do that locally within certain teams. And having that same corporate culture that is focused on just exploitation is now going to inhibit sort of the exploration or innovation in these more local groups. And if I have too much of a culture conflict there, then I might as well go out a different one. But if I can somehow locally manage that, then that will work. Maybe I'm over rephrasing what you just said.
No, but that's exactly what happens unless you actively decide to manage otherwise. So as you grow, you're small, you're focused on innovation because that's what matters in our business. As you grow and become more focused on commercial, you become focused on that. You don't actually continue to remember, I've got to continue to manage actively for an innovation environment at these early stages. You start to drift. And so I've seen it a tons of times in this business where managers and management forget what got them there, and they lose focus on creating the right ecosystem for the early stages that they almost had by accident. So if it's actively managed and you understand those different workflows, you can organize around them.
Phil, did you want to add something to this?
Well, I was just on your question about, acquiring innovation. I mean, certainly there are lots of examples of companies that do that. But there's a lot of challenges with that as well, right? First of all, like I was saying, it's expensive. You're paying a premium once something's been determined to be successful. And then you still have the culture and environment issues that you still have to overcome, because once you acquire and start to integrate that innovative, smaller startup, the biggest resource for innovation are the employees. And how do you keep them? Because once they come into an organization that isn't good at innovating, by and large, most of them leave after their handcuffs expire. And then you're left taking that innovation and trying to make it successful in a company that wasn't successful at creating its own innovations. And so, probably not surprising that, 80% of acquisitions are unsuccessful, right? And so I don't think it's a panacea. I think it's part of a valid part of an innovation strategy. But to your point of not one size fits all, I don't think that could be your only innovation strategy if you want to be successful.
So the issue that you just highlighted of human capital being very mobile and walking out of the door is certainly a big hindrance to acquiring innovation. The companies that come to mind that have been quite successful in acquiring innovation are companies like Cisco.
Exactly.
So is the right thing to do just to, when I acquire a company, to require these long handcuffs or not have people walk out the door? Or is it maybe just better to be known for being a good acquirer that allows the acquired company to maintain its own culture, its own ecosystem?
But with Cisco, and Cisco is probably the best example, and I don't know of any other good examples, which is probably telling, it's because that's part of their DNA, right? They celebrate and support all the companies that they buy, right? And they've got their DNA that's how they're going to innovate, and they're going to make sure that they allow those companies and those individuals that they acquire to be successful. And that's just their strategy. But I haven't seen other companies that are so focused on making acquisitions and supporting them to work at that level.
Great. There's many of you are asking questions. Please keep them coming. I apologize if we can't cover all of them. Let me go to yet another one asked by our audience that is interesting for me personally. So I apologize to our audience if they don't quite find it as interesting. But one of our viewers asked, what are the most important university policies and practices to encourage higher rates of technology commercialization? So it speaks a little bit to some of the research that I've seen previously that is mainly focused on cash flow and control rights. So what happened, for example, in Norway was that professors at Norwegian universities owned 100% of the cash flow rights to innovations that they come up came up with, or patents that they own. And then these cash flow rights were reduced from 100% to only 33%. Now, anybody who's an economist would not be surprised to see that that led to a 50% decline in university innovation. So suddenly, you know, I'm not getting $100 for my innovation, but I'm just getting $33 for my innovation. Obviously, I'm not gonna be as focused on making innovation happen. On the other hand, you know, in the United States and in Canada and many other Western countries, we have always encouraged this sort of split between university and professors. And it mirrors a little bit this issue of like how much cash flow rights do we give, or how much control rights do we give to the originators of the idea, as well as how much does the organization retain. Where on the one hand, we do want to give some cash flow rights, of course, to the inventors, but you know, the company or the organization itself also has to benefit. Are there other things that that sort of companies can do, or universities in particular can do, to drive commercialization of technological innovations? I'll ask Phil here because he works directly in this sphere.
Yeah, and I've been on both sides of the coin, within the university and in private sector, working with universities on joint research projects. And a lot of it mirrors the conversation we've been having, right? How do you go and ensure that you foster and have a culture of collaboration? And how do you not put policies in place that prevent that? So for example, right, I've worked with universities that are so rigid from a private sector standpoint that their only way to work with them is that whatever you bring into the university, regardless of whose idea it originated from, it's a 50-50, you know, split of IP. And that's just not, you know, not flexible enough for, you know, a lot of the projects that we would have wanted to work with universities on. And so, you know, it's very similar to the previous conversation about how do you go and make sure that you have flexibility, that you have a culture that allows for collaboration, you know, within the university. You know, some of the tenure policies. Yeah, I know you're very familiar with this. Don't incent faculty to go and drive commercialization and partnerships with corporations and outside entities, and so it's a very similar set of things that need to be done to make sure that you have a culture that is flexible and allows for collaboration.
So there's been a lot of interest in our question or in our debate on buying innovation. Risto asks whether there's a middle ground between outright acquisitions and sort of doing all the innovation in-house that would leave the creative environment at the innovative company intact. Is it alliances or licensing or other forms of cooperation the way forward on this? Bob, do you have you were high on sort of this question earlier. If you could hear from you on this.
Sure. So, you know, I think in our business,
I think we have Bob. Are you still there?
There is sort of a segmentation, people creating something that hasn't been done before. Sort of the commercial. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now we can.
Okay. Sorry. So what I was saying is, I think that there are, in our industry, there are segments or different types of innovators, people who innovate on the core technology, like coming up with that brand new invention. Then there are technology integrators who sort of bring things together into sort of commercial execution and regulatory innovation. I think that alliances are essential on the early stages, and they can help. And where they're destructive is when you claim to be great in a certain new technology, innovative area, and then you do an acquisition. When you bring that acquisition in, you lose all the talent that Phil talked about, but you also tell your organization, we're actually not really that good at that after all. Where it works is when you are doing complementary technology add-ons. At the later stages, in terms of the integrator stuff, I actually see that works well almost all the time when you're sort of integrating different technologies for functionality or improving things, at least in our business. That doesn't seem to have any rules to it. It's that earlier stage stuff where you claim to be the world's greatest expert in a certain fundamental technology area, where you can really destroy your culture with innovation based on how you do it. And that's where you need to be careful.
Great. Let me see. Let me go a little bit more and see whether we have more questions that. Oh, here's that we could ask our panelists. One, Frank Roshanga asks whether my panelists have heard of the Innovation Radar. So the Innovation Radar is product, customer, process, presence. And if so, do you consider it useful, or is it too mechanistic? Is it more about hiring the right people in the right organizational design? So I will profess that I know nothing about the Innovation Radar, despite being a so-called expert on innovation. But if any of my panelists have heard about it, can you speak to it? And do you find it useful when hiring or getting people to innovate?
I've seen a lot of things like it, metrics used in more discovery research areas. And again, it's really hard to measure what progress means when you're doing fundamental innovation and discovery. And so whether you can put it on your metrics in terms of how things align with your customer needs and all those things is so qualitative is it creates sort of a non-transparent way to assess your progress, and then it creates skepticism on decision making, and oftentimes managers will overrule it because they don't trust it. So I would say it's probably better at later stages of sort of technology integration. So again, it's sort of understanding your workflow, I guess, is my big thing, and what your work process is, and matching your metrics to it if you can do it is what's beneficial.
Yeah. Ashley, do you use any of these metrics when trying to decide who are the most innovative people that you'd like to hire?
We do not use specific metrics like that. We do, when we're looking at who we're hiring in particular, we do a lot of what Bob mentioned. I think it was Bob around. We throw cases at people, we throw scenarios at them, and let us see how they think and how they work. But we don't use a specific formalized metric process as is being described.
So we're approaching the end of our webinar. I want to close with one of the most provocative questions. Yuri Oliveira asks, Steve Jobs used to recommend graduates in high school to not go to university. And his main argument was that the best people he hires have incredible life experiences in place of academic honors or academic achievements or knowledge that Bob highlighted earlier. So the question is, does our panel here think that this is the right approach? Is it that life experiences are really more powerful than the knowledge that is imparted at universities, in particular when we think about innovation?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I think it's a combination. I don't think that you can just, have life experiences and not have any functional knowledge or area expertise. One of the great things about university and one of the ultimate goals is to be able to teach yourself, right? So that when you go and have these life experiences, you're actually taking away things from it, and you're broadening your knowledge base, based upon those life experiences. And so that ability to go and develop yourself. Some people may be able to do it without going to university, but I think for a lot of folks to develop that capability and that maturity, the university experience is the best way to go do that.
I think the beauty is in the blend. I think people coming out of school have wonderful knowledge and education and a lot of creativity actually that comes right out of all of that. But I think you can't replace experience. That's something that you can't get in school. Doesn't mean I don't think people should go to university. I think they should. But I think there's, you put the people with experience together with the people who have a great education, and I think you can get something really, really powerful there.
So I agree, and I hope the implication is that school is not interpreted as a non-life experience, but there is a certain I don't think it's related to how much school you've had. I think it's related to, do you all have experience in, at least on the innovation side, in not just knowledge accumulation, but you actually have knowledge in challenging, questioning, critiquing, pushing boundaries. And that's can be developed in some schools very well, and there are some schools designed just to do it, and there's some school environments that don't reward that behavior, so people don't get that muscle as much. But I think it's what we see is it's in everyone. It's just a muscle, you have to use it. And so I think the only thing I would, if you need those people right away as opposed to build them, you've got to add a screen for it, as Ashley talked about. That's important to get if you want them right away. Otherwise, you've got to invest in them building those muscles over time. Great.
Well, thank you very much to our wonderful panelists for answering all these questions. Thank you to you, to the audience, for joining in and asking questions. Thank you also to Ben Madison and Kayla Hayslip, our producers. I had a great time hosting this webinar, and I hope to see you again in the future for another Yale SOM webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.